It was one of those evenings when Lakewood felt almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the smell of pine and wet earth hanging in the air. I walked my usual route along the lake, hands tucked in my old cardigan, watching the mist rise off the water. I liked this time of day, when the world softened and memories of my husband didn't hurt as sharply. That night, though, peace didn't last long. I noticed headlights through the trees, coming down the narrow dirt road that led to the lake's edge. Few people drove that way after dark. The light stopped near the old dock, maybe 30 yards ahead of me. I slowed, thinking maybe someone had hit a deer. Then I recognized the car, a silver SUV. Emily's, my daughter-in-law. At first, I smiled, thinking she might have come here to clear her head. But she didn't get out calmly like someone out for a walk. She was jerky, her movements tight, like she was in a rush. The trunk popped open, and she dragged out something heavy. I squinted, adjusting my glasses. It was a large brown leather bundle, about the size of a suitcase, wrapped tight with rope. She stood there for a second, looking around. Then, before I could even call out, she swung it into the water. It hit with a dull, heavy thud that made the still lake ripple out in slow rings. I froze. She stood there, breathing hard, her arms trembling. The bundle sank halfway, bobbed up once, and then started to drift away from the shore. She stared at it for a long moment, then wiped her hands on her jeans, got back into the car, and drove off fast. Tires, spitting gravel. I couldn't move. My mind tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was old clothes. Maybe garbage. Maybe nothing at all. But deep down, something inside me whispered that it wasn't nothing. The moonlight caught on something metallic floating near the surface, glinting just long enough to pull me closer. I walked to the edge, my shoes sinking into the mud, and the cold smell of algae hit me. The bundle was drifting back toward shore, as if the lake itself didn't want to keep it. I found an old branch, hooked the rope, and pulled. The water was icy and heavy, and my hands shook as I dragged the thing onto the rocks. The leather was slick, the rope tight. It smelled faintly of something sweet and awful. I hesitated, then I knelt, untying the rope with trembling fingers. Inside was a small blanket, blue, soaked, darkened, sticking to the lining. I peeled it back, and the smell made my stomach turn. Underneath it were tiny clothes, a wooden rattle, and something folded and wet, a piece of paper. I opened it carefully. It was a birth certificate. Name Noah Barnes. Barnes, Emily's maiden name. The air went thin. My heart slammed so hard I had to sit back on the cold ground. The paper was torn, half the writing smeared by water and dirt, but the hospital stamp from Salem was still visible. My breath came shallow. I thought of what Emily had told us 2 years ago, how she'd miscarried, how she cried for weeks, how David nearly lost himself, trying to comfort her. I told myself there had to be an explanation. People throw away old things. She was emotional back then. Maybe she was trying to let go of the past. But that smell, that awful, thick smell clinging to the blanket. I didn't believe my own excuses. I wrapped everything back up, tied it again as best I could, and hauled it behind the bushes near my fence. I didn't know what I was going to do, only that I couldn't leave it there in the open. My mind kept circling the same thoughts. Why would she bring something like this here? In the dark. Alone, why hide it? And what on earth was inside that bundle before I found it? The night deepened, the air colder. My knees ached from kneeling, and I realized I had mud all over my cardigan. I picked up the torn half of the certificate and shoved it into my pocket before heading back to the house. Every creak of the old board sounded too loud. I locked the door and checked the windows twice, something I hadn't done in years. I made tea, though I didn't drink it. The clock ticked past 11. I sat in the dim kitchen light, staring out toward the backyard where I'd hidden the bundle. I wanted to call someone. But who? The police? What would I even say? My daughter-in-law threw something into the lake. And I think it might be. I couldn't finish the thought. The house was too quiet. Every sound felt sharper: the hum of the fridge, the whistle of the wind under the door. I kept seeing the look on Emily's face, that quick glance over her shoulder before she threw it. She hadn't looked scared. She'd looked angry, determined. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard a car again. I turned off the kitchen light and peeked through the curtain. Headlights moved slowly down the road toward the lake, the same direction Emily had gone. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone, but my hands were too shaky to dial. The car idled by the water for a minute. Then the lights cut out. For a few moments, everything went black. Then I saw a flashlight beam sweeping along the shoreline. Searching. Someone was looking for the bundle. I stood frozen by the window, barely breathing. After a while, the car started again and drove off, disappearing into the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn touched the lake, I stepped outside. The mist was thick, the world gray and quiet. My backyard smelled of damp earth and rain. I walked to where I'd hidden the bundle, touched the wet rope with the tip of my shoe, and whispered to myself, "What did you do, Emily?" I looked toward the lake one more time. The surface was smooth again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that whatever was inside that bundle was never meant to come back up. The morning came heavy and gray, the kind that makes the whole house feel colder than it should. I put on my robe and went to make coffee, still half hoping. The night before had been a nightmare. When I looked out the kitchen window, my heart jumped. David was in the backyard, near the fence line, digging. He was in jeans and a sweatshirt, his hair messy, his movements rough and hurried. I stood there, watching from behind the curtain. The dirt was damp and dark, and he had already dug a hole wide enough for something large. Then he went to his car, popped the trunk, and lifted out a small bundle wrapped in brown fabric. Even from that distance, I recognized the texture. It looked exactly like the leather I had pulled from the lake. I whispered to myself, "No." He carried it behind the chicken coop and knelt down. I pressed my hand to the cold glass. He set the bundle into the hole and began to cover it with dirt. My stomach turned. The same kind of rope I had untied last night was knotted around the fabric. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and looked toward the house. Toward me. I ducked back, heart racing, afraid he had seen me. A moment later, I heard the back door creak open. His voice came sharp and tired. "Mom, why are you up so early?" I tried to sound normal. "Couldn't sleep." "What are you doing out there?" "Just cleaning up," he said, his tone flat. "Burying some old junk." "Don't worry about it." "Old junk," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know how Emily hates clutter." He went upstairs before I could say another word. I watched him go, feeling the kind of chill that doesn't come from weather. Later that morning, Emily came into the kitchen. She looked perfect as always. Hair smooth, lipstick fresh, as if nothing in the world could touch her. "Morning, Mom," she said, pouring coffee like she owned the house. "Sleep well?" "Not really." She gave a small, polite laugh. "You should try melatonin. Works wonders." Her phone buzzed. She checked it, frowned for a split second, then smiled again. "I've got errands today. Don't wait up for dinner." She kissed David on the cheek as he came down the stairs and left, her heels clicking on the hardwood. I turned to David. "What's going on with her? She's been out late." "Coming home after midnight," he sighed. Mom. Please. Don't start. She's just busy. Busy doing what? He rubbed his face. Looking older than his 39 years. She's trying to get some new clients. Interior design stuff. You know how she is. Always dramatic. I wanted to tell him what I'd seen. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I said softly, "You two aren't hiding anything from me. Are you?" He looked up sharply. "Hiding? Why would you say that?" I hesitated. "I just worry about you. That's all." He shook his head. "I'm fine. Mom. We're fine. Please. Stop worrying so much." After he left for work, I waited a few minutes, then slipped on my boots and went outside. The ground behind the coop was still damp. I knelt down, tracing the shape of the freshly packed soil. There was a small piece of the brown fabric sticking out. The edge of it darkened with something that looked too red to be rust. I pulled back a bit of dirt and found a corner of the rope. The same rough rope I'd untied from the bundle the night before. My hands trembled as I covered it again. I didn't know what to think anymore. The air felt heavier. The smell of earth mixed with something metallic. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself with cleaning. I washed dishes that were already clean. Folded towels twice. But every sound made me jump. The house felt too quiet. Around 5. I heard the garage door open. David and Emily were home. Their voices carried down the hall. "You can't just act normal," Emily hissed. "I am acting normal," David said, his voice low and strained. "Not enough. You're shaking." Then lower. Almost a whisper. "If anyone finds out, we're done." I moved closer to the hallway. Emily's voice turned cold. "Don't forget what's at stake. The company. Everything." David muttered something I couldn't make out. Then there was silence. I stepped back quickly before they saw me. My heart hammered in my chest. At dinner, no one talked much. Emily smiled. Polite and sweet. Asking if I wanted more potatoes. Her nails were spotless. Her eyes, though, never met mine. After she went upstairs, I said quietly, "David, talk to me, please." He stared at his plate. "About what?" "Whatever you're hiding. I saw you this morning." He froze. Then he looked at me. The way he used to when he was a little boy caught in a lie. "What did you see?" "You were burying something." Behind the coop. He pushed his chair back. It was trash. Old paint rags. "You shouldn't snoop around like that." I wanted to scream that I knew he was lying. But the words caught in my throat. He left the table without another word. That night, the rain returned. I sat by the window, staring into the dark yard. The dirt behind the coop had turned into a patch of glistening mud. Lightning flickered. And for an instant, I thought I saw movement there. I blinked. Nothing. Just the wind and rain. The next morning, Emily was humming in the kitchen. Cheerful. Almost too cheerful. She was packing a small suitcase. The same shade of brown as the bundle. "Going somewhere?" I asked. "A quick weekend trip," she said. "Spa. Retreat. You know, stress relief." David avoided my eyes when I looked at him. I felt my stomach twist again. After they left, I went outside once more. The rain had washed away part of the dirt. A small piece of rope had surfaced. Frayed and pale. I stared at it. Feeling sick, I walked back into the house. My shoes leaving muddy prints on the kitchen floor. I sat down, hands shaking, and whispered to the empty room. "What are you both doing?" The house gave no answer. Only the steady ticking of the clock filled the silence. I looked out the window toward the backyard again. The place where my son had buried something I didn't dare name. And I knew this wasn't over. The next few days felt like walking through fog. I tried to keep busy. But my thoughts circled back to that patch of dirt behind the coop. I would look out the window every morning, half expecting to see the ground moving on its own. It stayed still, quiet, pretending to be innocent. David and Emily were both distant. He left early for work at Cole Construction, barely finishing his coffee. She floated around the house, humming, always on her phone. When she smiled at me, it never reached her eyes. By Wednesday, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed answers. When they left for work, I went straight to the backyard. The dirt had hardened a little after the rain, but I still saw the faint outline of where David had dug. I pushed a stick into the soil. It sank too easily, and a faint metallic smell came up with the damp air. My stomach turned. I told myself to stop. I was being paranoid. I was old, not crazy, but old enough to know when something wasn't right. I walked inside, washed my hands, and tried to think. If that bundle had been what I thought it was, there had to be a record of it. I remembered the torn birth certificate I had found in the leather wrapping. I pulled it from the drawer where I'd hidden it, flattened it out on the table, and studied it again. The hospital name was still visible, Salem Regional. I picked up the phone. The hospital receptionist sounded young and tired when I asked about a baby named Noah Barnes, born in 2021. She paused. "Ma'am, may I ask your relationship to the patient?" I hesitated. "I'm a family member," I said. "I used to teach there years ago." A little white lie. "I just need to confirm a detail for the family records." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That record is sealed. It lists the infant as deceased. Cause of death: asphyxiation. The file was closed 2 years ago." Asphyxiation. I thanked her and hung up. My fingers were cold against the phone. Emily had told us she miscarried that year. I'd brought her soup, prayed with her, watched her cry in David's arms. If the baby was born alive, why did she say it wasn't? I took a slow breath and stared at the backyard again. The gray sky pressed down on the house. Something had been buried there. Something tied to that baby's name. That afternoon, I walked over to my neighbor Laura Bennett's house. Laura had lived 2 doors down for 30 years. She opened the door with a smile that faded when she saw my face. "You look pale." "Maggie, what's wrong?" I told her I'd seen Emily at the lake that night. Laura's eyes widened. She leaned in close. "I thought that was her car. Last week, around midnight, I saw headlights down there. She was getting gas at the station the same night. Dressed up. Makeup perfect. Who buys gas at midnight, looking like that?" "You didn't tell anyone?" I asked. "Tell who?" Laura said. "You know how this town is. People talk. And besides, it's not my business. It might be mine," I said softly. She frowned. "Maggie, what are you saying?" I couldn't bring myself to answer. Instead, I thanked her and went home. That evening, I barely noticed the time passing. The sky darkened. The crickets started their song. And the house felt too big, too full of ghosts. I had just poured myself a cup of tea when the doorbell rang. Standing there on the porch was a man in a dark jacket with a badge clipped to his belt. Detective Carlos Reese, Lakewood Police Department. My heart sank. He held a small notebook. "I'm following up on a report about suspicious activity at Lakewood Lake. A local resident mentioned a car matching your description parked near the dock a few nights ago." I forced a smile. "Oh. I was walking that evening. I saw a car. But I didn't get a good look." "Whose car was it?" "Ma'am." I hesitated. "A silver SUV. Maybe. I didn't see the driver." He nodded, jotting notes. "Did you notice anything unusual in the water or along the shore?" My throat felt dry. I shook my head. "No. Nothing like that." He looked at me for a long second, as if weighing my words. Then he said, "If you remember anything, please call me. People dump all kinds of things out there. It's best we check early. After he left, I stood in the doorway, clutching the edge of the frame. The word dump echoed in my head. I closed the door, leaned against it, and tried to breathe. Later that night, Emily came home first. She set her purse down and looked straight at me. Was that the police I saw leaving? I froze. Yes. They asked about some vandalism near the lake. She smiled. But it wasn't kind. I see. Hope you didn't tell them anything unnecessary. I didn't. Good. She said softly. Sometimes you imagine things. Maggie, it happens at your age. You should rest more. Her voice was sugar and venom. I felt the air leave my lungs. A moment later, David came in, loosening his tie. Everything all right? Fine, I said quickly. He looked between us, suspicious but tired, then disappeared down the hall. Emily followed, her perfume lingering like a threat. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the window. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe grief and loneliness had finally twisted my mind. But the smell of wet leather and blood still clung to my memory. The torn certificate lay in front of me like proof that I hadn't imagined a thing. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the mist lift off the lake. For a moment, it looked beautiful again. Peaceful even. But I knew better. Somewhere out there, beneath the water or under the dirt in my own backyard, was the truth. And whatever it wasn't going to stay buried forever. The following days bled together in slow motion. Every sound, every movement in the house felt heavier than usual. Like the air itself carried secrets. I tried to stay calm, tried to keep my head clear, but it felt like walking on a frozen lake. One wrong step away from falling through. On Friday afternoon, I went to the backyard again. The ground behind the coop had hardened into a patchy mix of mud and gravel. I crouched down, tracing the faint outline of where David had buried that bundle. A crow landed on the fence, watching me, cawing once before flying away. I whispered to the air, "What did you do, my boy?" I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and stood up quickly. Emily's silver SUV pulled into the driveway. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward the porch, pretending I had been watering the plants. She stepped out, wearing sunglasses and a tight beige coat. Her lips painted red even though it was barely noon. She looked me over and smiled faintly. "Maggie, you really should rest more. You look pale." I forced a smile. "Just tired. That's all." She brushed past me, carrying 2 shopping bags, her heels clicking on the porch steps. I followed her into the house, the faint scent of perfume and cold air trailing behind her. "Did you go somewhere nice?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She turned, setting the bags on the counter. "Just errands. Picking up a few things for the house." I glanced at the bags. Inside one of them was a roll of duct tape, a new tarp, and cleaning gloves. My heart skipped. "For cleaning," she said quickly, following my gaze. "David's been meaning to fix the garage roof, so I thought I'd get ahead of it." I nodded, but something about her tone felt rehearsed. She started unpacking the bags with sharp, deliberate movements, like she wanted to remind me whose house this really was. That evening, when David got home, they argued in the living room. Their voices were low at first, then sharper. "You can't just do things without telling me," he snapped. "Someone had to." Emily shot back. "You froze up last time. Remember, it's not that simple," he said. "You don't understand what it feels like." She laughed coldly. "I understand perfectly. You made a mess, and I cleaned it up. That's what I do." I was standing in the hallway, hidden by the corner. My chest felt tight. I heard something crash. Maybe a glass thrown at the wall. And then footsteps. Emily stormed out of the room, her face stiff with anger, and grabbed her purse. She glanced at me as she passed. "You might want to talk to your son. Maggie. He's losing it." She slammed the door on her way out. I waited a minute before walking into the living room. David sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The glass shards glittered on the floor beside him. I sat down quietly. "Want to tell me what's going on?" He looked up at me, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. "I can't. Mom, you wouldn't understand. Try me," I said softly. He shook his head, ran a hand through his hair. "Just leave it. Please. It's better if you don't know." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to cry. "I raised you better than this, David. Whatever you're mixed up in, hiding it won't fix it." He looked at me then, really looked at me. And for a moment I saw the frightened boy he used to be. His lips parted, like he was about to tell me something. But then his phone buzzed. He checked the screen, his expression hardening. "I have to go," he said, standing up. "It's work." He grabbed his keys and left, the front door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt final. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Emily's voice in my head. "You froze up last time." What did that mean? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling until the first light of morning crept through the blinds. Around 7, I walked to the kitchen to make coffee. I noticed something strange. The backyard motion light was on, even though it was daylight. I stepped outside, my slippers sinking into the damp grass. Near the fence, the dirt behind the coop had been disturbed again. The soil was darker, freshly turned. My breath caught. Someone had been out here during the night. I knelt and brushed away a bit of the dirt. This time, something small and metallic glinted up at me. I pulled it free. It was a silver bracelet, the kind hospitals put on newborns. The name on it was faded but still readable. Noah Barnes. My knees gave out, and I sat down hard in the wet grass, clutching the bracelet like it burned. The back door creaked. I turned and saw Emily standing there in her robe, holding a cup of coffee. "Out early." "Aren't you?" she said softly. I closed my hand around the bracelet, my heart hammering. Couldn't sleep. She stepped closer, her smile thin. "You really should stay out of that area, Maggie. There are raccoons, snakes sometimes. You wouldn't want to get hurt." Her voice was calm, but her eyes weren't. They were sharp, deliberate, watching every twitch of my hand. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll keep that in mind." She turned and walked back inside, and I sat there, shaking until I heard the door close. Then I opened my hand again, staring at that tiny bracelet. My mind raced. I needed help. Proof. Someone who would believe me. I wrapped the bracelet in a paper towel, slipped it into my pocket, and went inside. That afternoon, while David was still at work, I drove to the police station. The same detective from before, Ruiz, was there. He looked up as I approached the desk. "Mrs. Allen." "Right, find something." I set the bracelet down on the counter, still wrapped. His expression shifted immediately. "Where did you get this?" I hesitated. "Behind my house, near the fence." He nodded slowly, unwrapping it. His eyes narrowed when he saw the name. Noah Barnes. He asked me to wait, disappeared into a back office, and returned 10 minutes later with a younger officer and a small evidence bag. "We'll need to examine the area," he said. "Can we come by your property today?" "Of course." He gave me a long, searching look. "Is there something you're not telling me?" "Mrs. 5. Allen." I swallowed hard. "Maybe there is. But you'll see for yourself soon enough." I left the station with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The bracelet felt like both a curse and a key. For the first time, I wasn't sure which it was. By the time I got back home, the afternoon sun had already started to fade behind the trees. The air felt heavy. Still, like the moment before a storm. I parked in the driveway and sat for a while, gripping the steering wheel, wondering what I had just set in motion. A police car pulled up not long after. Detective Ruiz stepped out with 2 officers. They followed me to the backyard, boots crunching on the gravel path. He spoke quietly as we walked. "You said this is where you found it." "Yes, right behind the coupe." He crouched down, studying the soil. The officers began setting up small markers, taking photos, careful not to disturb anything. One of them used a metal detector, and within minutes, it started to beep. Ruiz nodded at him. "Dig carefully." The first few inches were just dirt and wet leaves. Then, the shovel hit something solid. They knelt down and brushed it off gently. When I saw the edge of leather, my knees weakened. Ruiz glanced up at me, his face tightening. "You should wait inside, Mrs. Allen." "No. I need to see." He hesitated, then nodded to the officers. "Keep going." They pulled up the bundle slowly. The smell hit first. Thick and rotten. I pressed my hand to my mouth. The leather was stiff, almost black from moisture. One of the officers slid it open. Inside were layers of old towels and plastic. Beneath that, something small and pale. Ruiz inhaled sharply and stood. "Ma'am. Please." I turned away. But it was too late. I had seen enough to know it wasn't just an animal. I stumbled back, the world spinning. Ruiz called for backup, his voice calm but urgent. Within minutes, the yard filled with flashing lights. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape, and a coroner's van pulled into the driveway. I sat on the porch steps, shaking. My hands were cold even though it was warm outside. Ruiz came over, crouching to meet my eyes. "I need to ask you something," he said gently. "Who has access to your property?" "My son. His wife. Just us." "Has anyone acted strangely lately?" My throat was too dry to speak. After a moment, I whispered, "You'll find their fingerprints on that leather." He didn't respond, just gave a slow nod. They worked in silence for what felt like hours. The coroner eventually left with a small covered stretcher. Ruiz walked back to me, his face grim. "We'll need to run tests. But it's consistent with an infant." "I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes. The bracelet in my pocket felt heavier now, like a stone pressing into my chest. The next few days were a blur of police visits and whispered questions. Neighbors watched from their porches as investigators came and went. Emily and David returned home late that night. When they saw the police tape, Emily froze, her hand gripping David's arm. "What happened?" she asked, her voice too high, too careful. Ruiz stepped forward. "Mrs. Allen. Mr. Allen. I need you both to come with me for questioning." David's face went pale. "What? Why?" "Routine," Ruiz said evenly. "Standard procedure." Emily's expression didn't change. Her voice stayed calm, almost polite. "Of course. Detective. Anything you need." They left in separate cars. The house felt emptier than ever. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of tea in front of me, listening to the silence. It was close to midnight when David came back. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes red. He didn't speak at first. He just sat across from me. "They think we did something," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you?" He looked up, startled, like I had slapped him. "Mom." "No." "God." "No." "Then tell me what's going on. Please." He rubbed his hands together, staring at the table. "Emily had a baby," he said softly. 2 years ago. I already knew. But hearing it from him still hit me like a blow. She told me it was stillborn. He continued. She said the hospital handled everything. I believed her. I didn't see a death certificate. I didn't ask questions. Why not? Because she was broken. Mom. Or I thought she was. She cried for weeks. I was trying to hold everything together. And now. He shook his head. His voice cracking. I don't know what to believe anymore. I reached across the table, placing my hand on his. We'll get to the truth, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The next morning, Detective Ruiz returned. His tone was polite but serious. We found fingerprints on the leather. Yours, Mrs. Allen. And your son's? I swallowed hard. I touched it when I found it. That's how I got the bracelet. He nodded. That lines up with your statement. But there's more. We found traces of cleaning solution and duct tape. We're running DNA now. He paused. Then added, Mrs. Allen. Your daughter-in-law's alibi doesn't hold up. She told us she was at a spa that night. There's no record of that. I said nothing. We'll need you both to stay available. He said. Don't leave town. After he left, I sat by the window, watching the police car disappear down the road. Emily came home an hour later. She walked straight into the kitchen. Her expression unreadable. They questioned me for 6 hours, she said, setting her purse on the counter. Did they? She turned slowly. What exactly did you tell them? The truth. Her eyes darkened. That was a mistake. I stood, feeling my heart hammer. What did you do? Emily. She stepped closer, her voice dropping low. Careful. Maggie. You're old. But not helpless. Don't make yourself the next one people start asking questions about. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled again, as if she hadn't said a thing, and walked upstairs. I stayed there long after she was gone, staring at the floor, listening to her footsteps fade. Something had broken wide open, and I knew, one way or another. It was only a matter of time before everything buried in this house clawed its way to the surface. That night I barely slept. Every sound in the house made me jump. The wind rattled the old windows, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I kept hearing her voice, soft but sharp, echoing in my head. Don't make yourself the next one. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep living under the same roof as her. By morning, I decided I couldn't. I got dressed, took my car keys, and drove straight to the police station. The streets were quiet, the sky still pale. When I walked in, Ruiz was pouring himself coffee. He looked surprised to see me. Mrs. Allen, are you all right? No, I said, and I'm not safe. He motioned for me to sit. Tell me what's going on. I told him everything. About Emily's threats, the bracelet, the argument I overheard, the night I saw her throw something into the lake. He didn't interrupt, just kept jotting notes. When I finished, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the cup of water he offered. He looked serious. We're working on the DNA tests now. If they match her, we'll have enough for an arrest. But until then, you need to stay somewhere else. Do you have family nearby? I shook my head. My sister's in Oregon. It's just me. He thought for a moment, then said, There's a safe lodging program we use for witnesses. It's quiet. Anonymous. I can arrange it tonight. I nodded. Anything to get away. When I got back home, David was in the kitchen. He looked exhausted. His shirt wrinkled. Eyes hollow. Mom. Where were you? At the station. He frowned. You went to Ruiz again. Yes. He ran a hand through his hair. Emily's furious. She thinks you're trying to ruin us. I wanted to laugh. Us, you mean her? No. Mom, he said sharply. Us. This family. Family doesn't bury babies in the backyard. I snapped. He flinched like I'd hit him. His mouth opened. But no sound came out. I saw tears gather in his eyes before he turned away. You don't know everything, he said quietly. Then tell me. Please. He hesitated for a long time. Finally, he whispered. I think she's dangerous. The words hung in the air. He leaned against the counter, his voice trembling. The night of the lake, I wasn't home. She told me she was visiting her mother. But when she came back, she was shaking. Said she hit a deer. Asked me to clean out the trunk before taking the car in. There was blood on the tarp. Mom. But it didn't smell like an animal. I covered my mouth. Oh. God. I confronted her. He said. She told me if I ever talked, she'd destroy me. Said she had proof of something that could send me to prison. Proof of what? He hesitated. Money. My name on a loan for her business. Fraud. I didn't even know she forged it until it was too late. She said if she goes down, I go with her. I stared at him. My heart breaking. You're my son. We can fix this. He shook his head. It's too late. She's in control now. Before I could respond, the front door opened. Emily stepped in, smiling like she'd walked into a church picnic. Morning, she said sweetly. What are you two whispering about? David straightened. Nothing. She tilted her head, watching us. Then she smiled at me. You look tired. Maggie, maybe you should take a trip. Visit your sister. I forced a smile. I was just thinking the same thing. Her smile widened, but her eyes stayed cold. Good. Fresh air might do you good. She went upstairs, her heels clicking on the steps. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close, then turned to David. I'm leaving tonight, but you need to promise me something. What? If anything happens, you call Ruiz. You tell him everything, no matter what she says. He nodded, though I could see the fear in his eyes. That afternoon, I packed a small bag, careful not to make noise. My heart pounded with every creak of the floorboards. I slipped the bracelet and the torn birth certificate into a folder, zipped it in my purse, and drove to the motel Ruiz had arranged. It was a small, quiet place near the edge of town, with peeling paint and humming neon lights. The clerk gave me the key without asking questions. Inside, the room smelled faintly of detergent and old air conditioning. I double-locked the door and sat on the bed, finally able to breathe. But peace didn't last. Around 9, my phone buzzed. It was David. His voice was shaking. Mom. She's gone. Gone. She left in the middle of dinner. Said she was going to the store. But she never came back. Did you call the police? Not yet. I thought maybe she just needed air. But there's something else. He paused. There was a bag in the garage, full of cash. At least 50,000. My blood went cold. She's running, I whispered. Before I could say more, the line went dead. I called back, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. My chest tightened. I grabbed my purse, ran to the car, and sped toward the house. When I turned onto our street, I saw the police already there. 2 cars, lights flashing. Ruiz stood near the porch, talking to another officer. When he saw me, he walked over quickly. Mrs. Allen, you shouldn't be here. What happened? Where's my son? He hesitated. We got a call from your neighbor. She heard shouting. Then a loud bang. I felt my knees weaken. Is he alive? He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he's being taken to the hospital. I could barely breathe. Ruiz put a hand on my shoulder. We think Emily shot him. Then she fled. Her car's gone. I stared at him. Numb. The world tilted. My vision blurring. Somewhere behind me, I heard the wail of an ambulance. The rush of feet. Radios crackling. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. As they lifted David onto the stretcher, I caught a glimpse of his face, pale and still. I took a step forward, but Ruiz held me back. Let them work, he said gently. The paramedics shut the doors, and the ambulance drove off into the night. I stood in the flashing red and blue lights, my hands trembling, the cold wind stinging my face. I thought about the bundle in the lake, the dirt in my yard, the baby's bracelet in my pocket, and I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of something much darker. The hospital smelled like bleach and heartbreak. I followed the nurse down a narrow hallway, my shoes squeaking on the tile floor. The lights were too bright, the air too cold. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she opened the curtain to his room, I thought my legs might give out. David lay there, pale as paper, hooked up to machines that beeped softly, a bandage wrapped around his shoulder. Stained faintly pink, his eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling in slow, fragile movements. The nurse touched my arm gently. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable now. You can sit with him. I nodded, barely hearing her, and took the chair beside the bed. I reached for his hand. It was cold, limp, but it twitched faintly when I held it. I leaned in, whispering his name. David. It's Mom. You're safe now. He stirred, his lips parting. Mom. I felt tears sting my eyes. I'm here. Sweetheart. Don't talk. Just rest. He blinked slowly, trying to focus. She's gone, he whispered. I know. Ruiz told me. She wanted me dead. I squeezed his hand tighter. No one's going to hurt you again. I promise. His eyes fluttered closed again. I sat there for hours, holding his hand, watching the machines blink in quiet rhythm. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and I realized I hadn't eaten all day. When Ruiz arrived, I could tell from his face he hadn't slept either. He stood at the foot of the bed, his expression heavy. How is he? Stable, I said softly. He nodded. We found Emily's car near the county line. Empty. No sign of her. My stomach sank. So she's out there. He nodded again. We think she's heading north. Maybe trying to cross into Canada. We've got state troopers watching the routes. I looked at my son, asleep and pale. Then back at Ruiz. What happens now? He hesitated. The forensic tests came back. The remains from your yard match the hospital records for baby Noah Barnes. DNA confirms he was Emily's biological child. My chest tightened. So she killed her own baby. It appears that way. I felt the room tilt for a moment, my breath catching. The image of that tiny bracelet flashed in my mind, the name still etched on the metal. I thought of Emily's smile, that practiced, perfect grin that never quite reached her eyes. Ruiz spoke again, gently. She's been on the run before, changed her name twice. We found a trail of debts, fake IDs, even a marriage she never dissolved. She's dangerous. Mrs. Allen, if she contacts you, call me immediately. I nodded. I will. After he left, I sat in silence. The steady beep of the monitor, the only sound in the room. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down I knew better. Emily wasn't the kind of person who disappeared quietly. The next morning, David woke up again, his voice hoarse. Mom, I'm sorry. For what? For bringing her here. For everything. I brushed his hair back from his forehead. None of this is your fault. He turned his head away. tears pooling in his eyes. I should have seen it sooner. The money, the lies, the way she kept things from me. She made me think I owed her, that I couldn't live without her. She made everyone believe what she wanted. I said softly. People like her always do. He was quiet for a while, staring at the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice was faint. She said if she ever got caught, she'd take everything down with her. I frowned. What do you mean? He turned his head toward me. She said she had proof. Something hidden. Proof of what? I don't know. But whatever it is, she said it would ruin me. Ruin you too. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Do you know where she kept it? He closed his eyes, thinking. The attic. Maybe. Or her studio. Somewhere in the house. I stayed with him until the nurse came in for vitals, then slipped out quietly. On the way home, the sky had turned gray. Clouds rolling in over Lakewood. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the first drops of rain had started to fall. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was watching. I turned on the lights, every creak of the floorboard echoing through the halls. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding, and made my way to Emily's studio. The door was locked. She'd always kept it that way. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and smashed the handle clean off. The smell hit me first. Faint perfume mixed with something chemical. The room was neat, almost too neat. Canvases leaned against the wall, paintbrushes arranged in perfect rows. But near the corner, behind a bookshelf, the wallpaper had peeled slightly. I tugged at it, and a small panel came loose. Inside was a narrow wooden box. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. It wasn't locked. Inside were stacks of envelopes, neatly labeled, and a flash drive taped to the lid. I opened one of the envelopes. It was a photocopy of a death certificate. Noah Barnes. Cause of death undetermined. Signature forged. Another envelope held photos. My throat went dry. They were of David. At his construction site. At the bank. And one of me standing outside the house. All marked with dates. There was a note written in her handwriting. If anything happens to me, these go to the press. I stared at it, my stomach turning. She'd planned everything, even her own downfall. Then I heard it, a faint sound from downstairs. The front door. I froze, listening. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I reached for my phone, but it slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice drifted up. Soft. Familiar. And full of venom. Maggie. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The voice came again. Closer this time. You really should have minded your own business. I grabbed the hammer from the floor, clutching it tight, and stepped into the hallway. The lights flickered as thunder rumbled outside. I saw her at the bottom of the stairs, soaked from the rain. Eyes wild and shining. Her hair was a tangled mess, her coat torn. She smiled when she saw me. Miss me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, like it might split in two. Then she started climbing the stairs, slow and steady. One hand on the railing. I didn't look away. My grip tightened on the hammer. My heart pounded so hard I thought she could hear it. Whatever was about to happen, I knew it would end here. In this house. With one of us walking away. Her voice cut through the thunder like a knife. I gripped the hammer tighter. Every instinct in me, screaming to run. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor. Emily climbed slowly, each step deliberate, her soaked boots thudding against the wood. The smell of rain and mud filled the hallway. She stopped halfway up the stairs and tilted her head. You look like you've seen a ghost. Maggie. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. You need to leave. Her smile widened. This is my house too. Remember, or it was before you decided to play detective. I raised the hammer slightly. The police know everything. Emily. They found the box. They know about Noah. For a second, her face changed. The mask slipped, and something darker flickered underneath. Then she laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. Oh. Maggie. You really are predictable. You think you can win this by running to the cops. You have no idea what you've started. She took another step up. The storm outside cracked, loud enough to shake the windows. You killed your own child, I said, my voice trembling. Her smile vanished. You don't know what happened. You think I wanted that. You think I planned it. I shook my head, backing away. Then why hide it? Why bury him like garbage? Her eyes blazed. Because I had no choice. He wasn't David's. And if he found out, I'd have lost everything. He would have left me. And your perfect little family would have eaten me alive. The words hit me like a slap. She was breathing hard now, shaking, mascara streaking down her face. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. I did what I had to. There's always a choice, I whispered. Always. She stared at me, her chest heaving. Then her expression hardened again. Maybe you're right. Maybe there is. Before I could react, she lunged forward. I stumbled back, swinging the hammer wildly. It missed her shoulder by inches and hit the wall with a dull thud. She grabbed my wrist, twisting it until the hammer clattered to the floor. We struggled, knocking into the hall table. A lamp crashed to the ground. Glass shattering across the hardwood. She pushed me against the wall, her face inches from mine. You should have stayed quiet, she hissed. I kicked at her shin, and she lost her grip. I stumbled away, grabbing the edge of the banister for balance. She went for the hammer, but I reached it first, swinging it hard this time. It hit her arm, and she screamed. We both froze, breathing heavy. Her eyes flicked to the open door of the studio down the hall. The flash drive was still sitting on the desk, right where I'd left it. She ran for it. I chased her, heart pounding. She grabbed the flash drive and turned toward the stairs. You won't ruin me, she shouted. I'll burn it all down before I let you take me. I lunged, catching her sleeve. We struggled at the top of the stairs, both of us slipping on the wet floor. She clawed at my hands, trying to break free. I heard her gasp, her boot sliding on the polished wood. Then she fell. The sound was sickening. A dull crack followed by silence. I stood frozen, staring down the staircase. She lay crumpled at the bottom, motionless. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The only sound was the rain pounding against the windows. Finally, I forced myself to go down. My legs shook with every step. When I reached her, I knelt beside her. Her eyes were half open, her breathing shallow. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. Emily, I whispered. Her lips moved, barely audible. You think this ends with me? Then her eyes rolled back, and she went still. I sat there on the floor, soaked in sweat and rainwater, staring at her. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I wanted to believe it was over, but her words wouldn't leave my mind. You think this ends with me? Sirens wailed in the distance. I must have called 911, though I didn't remember dialing. The next thing I knew, the house was full of flashing lights and shouting voices. Paramedics rushed in, pushing me gently aside. She's alive, one of them said. Barely. Ruiz appeared in the doorway, his coat dripping, his eyes scanning the chaos. Mrs. Alan. Are you hurt? I shook my head, still staring at the stairs. She tried to kill me. He nodded grimly. We got your call. Sit down. Please. I sat on the couch, numb, watching as they carried her out on a stretcher. Her head rolled to the side, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no fear in hers, no remorse, only something cold, almost satisfied. After they left, Ruiz stayed behind, walking through the house, taking photos, asking quiet questions. When he was done, he sat across from me. You did the right thing, he said. But I need you to understand something. This isn't over yet. I frowned. What do you mean? He glanced toward the stairs. When we searched her car, we found an envelope addressed to you. It was empty. Whatever she meant to send. It's missing. I felt the blood drain from my face. We're going to go through everything she left behind, he continued. Until then, I need you to stay somewhere safe again. I nodded slowly, staring at the floor. The sound of the rain had softened to a steady drizzle, tapping against the windows like a heartbeat. The house felt hollow, stripped of everything that once made it a home. After Ruiz left, I walked back upstairs, every creak echoing in the empty halls. I stopped at the top step, staring down where she had fallen. The blood had already been cleaned up, but a faint stain remained, dark against the wood. I thought of David in the hospital, of the baby's name on that tiny bracelet, of all the lies that had poisoned our family. In the silence, I whispered to no one. Maybe she's right. Maybe it doesn't end here. Lightning flashed outside, and for a second, I saw my reflection in the window. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked older, harder, like someone who had seen too much and lost too much to ever go back. The thunder rolled again, low and distant. I turned off the light and stood there in the dark, waiting for morning, not sure what it would bring. The sun rose behind a thick curtain of fog that morning, turning Lakewood into a blur of silver and gray. I hadn't slept. The night stretched on endlessly, filled with sirens and flashes of memory I couldn't shut off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face again, bloodied but smirking, whispering that final warning. Maybe it doesn't end here. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in Detective Ruiz's office. He looked more tired than I felt. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on his desk, steam long gone. He handed me a folder without a word. Inside were photographs, the hidden box, the forged documents, the hospital records, and one picture of Emily, taken that morning at the county medical center. Alive but barely conscious. They moved her to a secured ward overnight, he said. She hasn't spoken yet. We're keeping guards on her 24 hours. I traced the edge of one photograph, the image of that flash drive glinting on the desk, and the file she meant to send. We're still searching, he replied. There's a chance she had help. Help from who? That's what we're trying to find out. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's something else. The medical examiner's report came in. The remains from your property match a death from 2021. But there's evidence the body was moved. Moved, I repeated. Yes. Meaning whoever buried the child did it after the fact. Someone tried to hide it. I sat back, my hands cold. David didn't do that, I said automatically. Ruiz Siged. We can't prove that. Not yet. But he's still under investigation for aiding in concealment of evidence. I felt my stomach twist. My son was lying in a hospital bed, barely able to speak, and the world was still coming after him. Before I could respond, Ruiz's phone buzzed. He answered, listened for a moment, and his expression changed. He stood up quickly. That was the station. Emily's awake. He looked at me. You want to come? No, I said, my voice small. Not yet. He nodded and left, his coat swinging behind him. I stayed in his office a while longer, staring out the window at the drizzle, turning to rain. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was exhaustion. That evening, I went back to the house. The police tape had been taken down, but the smell of bleach still lingered. I made tea I didn't drink, turned on the lamp beside the couch, and sat in silence. Around 9, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting Ruiz. It wasn't him. Mrs. Allen, said a voice I didn't recognize. This is Officer Kyle. Lakewood PD. Detective Ruiz asked me to let you know we've arrested Emily Barnes. I gripped the phone tighter. What happened? She was caught near the North Docks. Tried to board a freight boat under a false name. My throat went dry. Did she say anything? He hesitated. She asked for you. For me. Yes. Ma'am. She said she'd only talk if you were there. I sat there in silence for a long moment, listening to the rain hit the roof. Finally, I said I'd be there in the morning. When I arrived at the station the next day, the air inside felt colder than it should. Ruiz met me at the door, his jaw tight. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I do. I told him. He led me down a narrow hallway to an interview room. Emily sat at the table, wrists cuffed, hair damp, face pale but composed. She looked up as I entered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Well, look at you, she said. The hero of Lakewood. I stayed standing. What do you want? Emily. She tilted her head. Closure. Maybe. Or just to see your face when I tell you how wrong you are. Ruiz stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching silently. Emily leaned forward. You really think you know the whole story? Don't you, that I'm the monster and your precious son is the victim? You killed your baby. I said quietly. That's not a story. That's fact. Her smile didn't fade. You think I did it alone? The room went still. She continued, voice soft but deliberate. David helped me. He wrapped him up. He carried him to the car. I told him it was stillborn. But he didn't check. He didn't want to. He just wanted it gone. That's not true, I said, my voice trembling. She looked me dead in the eyes. Isn't it? Ruiz stepped forward. That's enough. She leaned back in her chair, smirking. You'll never know what really happened. Maybe I smothered him. Maybe David did. Maybe he was already gone. Does it matter? He's dead. And you're the one who dug him up. My breath caught. She whispered. You wanted the truth. Now, you have it. Ruiz ended the interview and escorted me out. I walked out of the station in a daze, the words still echoing in my head. That night, I sat in my car by the lake. The fog had rolled in thick, swallowing everything but the faint reflection of the streetlights on the water. The same lake where it all started. I thought of the sound that bundle made when it hit the surface. The ripples spreading. The moonlight bending. My phone rang. Ruiz again. She's confessed, he said simply. Everything. She admitted to smothering the baby and forcing David to help cover it up. Said she wanted control. Money. Freedom. I closed my eyes. The weight of it all pressing down on me. What will happen to him? We'll take his statement. If what she said matches his version, he'll likely face lesser charges. He's a victim too. Mrs. Allen. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Before he hung up, he added quietly, you were right all along. I stayed there for a long time after the call ended. The lake was still. The water dark as glass. Somewhere across the shore, a loon cried out. The sound long and lonely. I whispered into the quiet, almost to the water itself. You can rest now, little one. Then I started the car. the headlights cutting through the mist, and drove home in silence. The echo of Emily's voice fading at last. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and floor wax. That sterile scent that never leaves a place built for judgment. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my hands folded in my lap. The faint tremor in my fingers impossible to hide. The walls felt too high. The air too dry. It was all too bright for what was about to unfold. David sat 2 rows ahead, his shoulders drawn in tight, his hair shorter now, his suit hanging a little loose. When he turned slightly, I caught the edge of his profile. The boy I raised hidden somewhere under the man, weighed down by guilt. Beside him sat his lawyer, a young man who looked too calm for what was at stake. Then they brought her in. Emily walked through the side door, wrists cuffed, chin high. Her orange jumpsuit was clean, her hair pulled back, her face pale but still proud. She didn't look like a woman defeated. She looked like someone waiting for her next chance. She didn't glance at me. Not once. She went straight to her seat, whispering something to her attorney before settling into stillness. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The scrape of chairs echoed against the marble walls. The first part of the day moved like molasses. Testimony after testimony. Forensic reports. Medical evidence. Digital records. The flash drive. The photographs. Her handwriting on the forged certificate. I sat through every detail. Every image. I wish I could forget. Then came David's turn. He walked to the stand slowly, his steps uncertain. I held my breath as he was sworn in. His voice shook when he began. "She told me the baby was gone before he was born," he said. I believed her. I didn't check. She said she handled the paperwork, that it was over. His lawyer nodded for him to continue. A few days later, she called me crying. Said she needed help getting rid of something. I didn't ask. I just did it. His words hit me like cold water. The courtroom stayed silent. "You didn't know what it was?" the prosecutor asked. David's voice cracked. I knew. I just couldn't admit it to myself. "And when you buried it," he swallowed hard. "I thought I was protecting her. Protecting us." The prosecutor stepped back. No further questions. When he walked back to his seat, he didn't look at me. He couldn't. I wanted to reach out, to tell him I forgave him. But my throat wouldn't work. Then Emily was called. She smiled as she took the stand, as if this were a show she had been waiting to perform. Her voice was smooth, almost gentle. "It was an accident," she said. "The baby wasn't breathing." I panicked. The prosecutor's tone hardened. "And the forged documents, the cash, the attempt to flee the country?" Her smile faltered for the first time. I was scared. "Everyone would have blamed me." "Is that why you shot your husband?" She hesitated, just long enough to let the silence bite. "He betrayed me. I wanted him to feel what I felt." I saw Ruiz, standing at the back of the courtroom, arms crossed, jaw tight. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final, cutting through the murmur that filled the room. "Enough," the judge said. The next morning, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. Second-degree murder, attempted homicide, fraud, forgery. When the judge read the sentence, Emily didn't flinch. Life in prison without parole. She only turned her head slightly, scanning the room, her gaze landing on David for the briefest moment before moving to me. Our eyes met for the first time since that night. There was nothing human left in hers. No apology. No fear. Just a hollow kind of defiance. Like she'd already accepted her place in hell and was proud of it. They led her out, her cuffs clinking softly. The door closed behind her. And it was over. David sat frozen for a long time. When I finally went to him, he didn't look up right away. His voice was quiet, almost childlike. "What happens to me now?" "You rebuild," I said softly, one piece at a time. He nodded but didn't answer. Ruiz walked over, resting a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing in the end. That's what matters. David gave a small, broken laugh. I did the right thing 2 years too late. Later that afternoon, as everyone drifted out of the courthouse, Ruiz found me standing alone on the steps. He handed me a manila envelope. What's this? I asked. Copies of the case files. And something else. He paused, his tone gentler now. There's a news outlet doing a story on you. They're calling it the Lakewood Truth. I shook my head. I didn't want attention. He smiled faintly. You might not want it, but people need to hear it. I looked past him toward the parking lot, where David was sitting in the car, staring straight ahead. The rain had started again. Light at first, then harder. I thought of the lake, of the way it used to reflect the sky before it became the grave for everything we lost. Before Ruiz left, he said, You've been through hell, Mrs. Allen. But you got justice. That's more than most ever do. Justice. The word felt heavy, like it didn't quite fit. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of cold tea, watching the rain streak down the glass. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. Every corner still held echoes of what happened. Every sound reminded me of what silence had cost. I thought about the baby, about Noah, his name still carved into that tiny bracelet, now resting in a box on my dresser. I thought about Emily's smirk, about David's trembling voice on the stand, about the moment I realized that the truth doesn't heal. It just settles into the cracks of what's left. The clock ticked toward midnight. I stood, walked to the back door, and looked out at the yard where the garden used to be. The grass had started to grow again, faint and green over the soil that once hid the unthinkable. For the first time in months, I whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, not even for peace, just for quiet, the kind of quiet that means nothing more will come crawling out of the past. The wind rose, brushing against the windows like a sigh. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled again, but this time, it didn't sound like warning. It sounded like an ending. By the time spring came back to Lakewood, the snow had melted into soft patches of mud, and the air smelled faintly of pine again. It had been 6 months since the sentencing, but the quiet I'd prayed for still hadn't come. The town moved on, as small towns always do. But the house felt like a hollow shell of what it once was. Some mornings I woke to the sound of birds at the window and thought for a second that everything had been a dream. Then I'd see the faint scar in the wood by the stairs where the blood never fully came out, and reality would settle in all over again. David was home from the hospital by late February. He spent most of his days sitting by the lake, the same one where this all began. His arms still hurt when the weather turned cold, and his eyes looked older than they should have. He rarely spoke unless I asked him a direct question. I didn't push. Some wounds heal in silence. One afternoon, I joined him by the water. The sky was a pale blue, the kind that almost looks washed out. The lake was calm, mirroring the trees and the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. We sat there for a long time without saying anything. Then he spoke, his voice soft. Do you ever think about him? Every day, I said. He nodded. Me too. The wind picked up slightly, sending ripples across the surface. I could tell he was fighting something inside him, the way his hand kept tightening and loosening on his knee. Finally, he said, I keep seeing his face. Even though I never saw him alive, I see him anyway. A little boy with her eyes in my hair. I put a hand over his. Maybe that's how God makes sure we remember. He looked out at the water again. I just wish remembering didn't hurt so much. I didn't have an answer for that. That evening, when I got home, there was a letter waiting in the mailbox. The envelope was thin, the paper creased. I knew before I opened it who it was from. Emily. I stood there for a long moment, staring at my own name written in her neat handwriting. I should have thrown it away. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The ink was faint. The words smudged in places. It said only 3 lines. You got what you wanted. But the truth isn't done with you yet. Tell him I forgive him. I folded the paper back up and put it in a drawer. Unsure if it was a threat or some twisted attempt at peace. I didn't tell David. Some things are better left unread aloud. The days grew longer. The snow gave way to wildflowers. And the tourists started coming back to Lakewood. Life returned to the surface. But underneath, the quiet unease remained. I could feel it in the way people looked at me in the grocery store. That mix of pity and curiosity. One morning, Pastor Helen came by the house. She had been a steady presence through it all. Never asking questions. Just showing up with coffee and a kind smile. She brought with her a small envelope and a folded piece of paper. It's from the county, she said. They're holding a memorial service for victims of family violence next month. They want to include Noah's name. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper. Thank you, I whispered. You should be there, she said gently. Closure doesn't mean forgetting. That night, I sat by my window and looked out at the backyard. The grass had grown thick over the spot where everything had been unearthed. I'd planted daisies there in April. White ones that caught the morning sun. They'd taken root quickly. Stronger than I expected. Maybe that was a sign. In June, I went to the memorial. It was held by the lake, under the big oak tree where children used to play. There were maybe 50 people there. Families holding photos. Names printed on small cards tied to white balloons. Pastor Helen read a prayer. Her voice steady. Then she called the names one by one. When she said Noah Barnes, I felt my knees weaken. I closed my eyes and whispered his name to myself. The balloon in my hand trembled in the breeze. After the ceremony, Officer Kyle came up to me. He was young, kind, and always polite. He handed me a small envelope. Detective Ruiz wanted me to give you this, he said. Inside was a copy of an article. The headline read, Elderly Woman Exposes Family Secret. Brings Justice to Lakewood. I sighed, folding it quietly. He smiled faintly. You did a brave thing, Mrs. Allen. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired, but I thanked him anyway. That evening, I went back to the lake alone. The water shimmered under the sunset, golden and calm. I carried a small wreath of daisies and wildflowers tied together with a ribbon. The kind of thing a teacher might make with her students. Simple and soft. I walked to the edge of the dock and set it gently on the water. The ripples spread slowly, carrying it toward the middle of the lake. I stood there watching until it was just a tiny blur of color against the fading light. For a long time, I didn't move. Then, quietly, I said, You're free now. The wind brushed against my hair. The lake sighed softly against the shore. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. When I turned to leave, I saw Ruiz standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets. He nodded toward the water. It's a good day for letting go, he said. It is, I replied. He looked at me for a moment, then smiled. You did more than bring justice, Mrs. Allen. You gave that child a name again. That matters. I smiled faintly. Maybe it does. He left after that. And I stood there until the sun dipped behind the hills. The air was warm. The sky painted in shades of gold and rose. I thought of everything we had lost. Everything that had been buried and then dragged into the light. Some truths destroy, but others cleanse. Maybe this one had done both. When I got home, I locked the door, turned off the lights, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. The lake glowed faintly in the distance, calm and still. The house was quiet, But this time it wasn't empty. It was resting. Outside. The wind carried the scent of pine and water through the open window. And I let it fill the room. For once, I didn't chase the memories away. I let them stay. Soft and harmless. Like ghosts that had finally found their place. The morning light slipped through the curtains, painting the kitchen in soft gold. I sat at the table with my tea, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of wind moving through the pines. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like it was breathing again. Not haunted. Not heavy. Just still. It had been almost a year since the trial. The seasons had turned over. The headlines had faded. And the people in town had found new stories to whisper about. Time had softened the sharpest edges of what happened. But the memories still lived in the corners, tucked between the creaks of the floorboards and the rustle of the trees by the lake. David had moved into a small apartment across town. He visited twice a week. Sometimes more when he couldn't sleep. He was going to therapy now. Seeing a counselor who helped him talk through things he'd spent years burying. He was thinner but stronger somehow. The way people look when they've decided to keep living. No matter how much it hurts. One Sunday morning, he showed up at my door with 2 cups of coffee and a nervous smile. He looked around the house like it was both familiar and strange. "You've changed things," he said. "A little," I told him. "Fresh paint. New curtains. You can't keep ghosts if you keep redecorating." He laughed quietly. "I miss this." We sat on the porch, watching the light move across the lake. The air smelled of summer rain, heavy with earth and green leaves. After a long silence, he said, "I started volunteering at the shelter downtown. They help families in crisis. Thought it might be good to do something that matters." I smiled. "It does matter." He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time in months. "I'm trying to make peace. Mom, I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm trying." "You do," I said softly. "We all do." He nodded. And for a while, neither of us spoke. The sun warmed our faces, and the lake shimmered like glass. Later that afternoon, after he left, I walked down to the dock. The daisies I'd planted by the shore had bloomed again. Taller this year, bending in the wind but refusing to fall. I knelt beside them, touching one of the petals. Life had a way of growing back, even in the places it shouldn't. That evening, Pastor Helen stopped by with her husband. They brought homemade pie and stayed for coffee. We talked about everything and nothing. The way people do when they've survived too much and finally learned to stop expecting tragedy. When they left, the sky was deep purple, the stars just starting to show. I stood on the porch after they drove off, wrapping my sweater tight, across the lake. A few porch lights blinked on, their reflections trembling on the surface. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called out, low and mournful. But the sound didn't hurt anymore. It was just part of the night. Inside, I took the small wooden box from the shelf above the fireplace. Inside it were 3 things: the baby's bracelet, the torn birth certificate, and a newspaper clipping of the verdict. I held them for a long time before putting them back and closing the lid. The past would always be part of me. But it didn't own me anymore. I spent the next few months turning the house into something new. I painted the living room a pale blue, the same color as the sky over the lake in the mornings. I turned Emily's old studio into a reading room, with shelves full of the books I used to teach from. On the wall above my desk, I hung a framed quote from my husband's favorite poem: "The truth will surface, no matter how deep you bury it." By the time autumn came, I was ready to leave the house behind. I sold it to a young couple from Portland who fell in love with the view. They didn't ask about its history, and I didn't tell them. Some truths are better left in peace once they've been faced. I moved into a small cottage closer to town. It has a garden, a cozy fireplace, and a porch that faces the west. Most evenings, I sit there with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Sometimes, Ruiz stops by when he's driving through. He always brings donuts, saying it's the least he can do for Lakewood's bravest grandma. As the papers once called me, it still makes me laugh. Last week, I got a letter from the Department of Corrections. Emily wanted to see me. I stared at the paper for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in a drawer. I didn't need to see her. Some apologies come too late. And some people never mean them anyway. Instead, I drove back to the lake one last time. It was quiet there. The air crisp. The water smooth as glass. The daisies were gone now, replaced by tall grass swaying in the wind. I stood at the edge of the dock and tossed a handful of wildflower seeds into the water. They scattered, floating for a moment before sinking beneath the surface. I whispered a prayer for peace. For Noah. For David. Even for Emily. Then I turned and walked away. As I reached the path leading back to the car, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The water shimmered under the setting sun, calm and endless, carrying everything it had ever held. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the weight lift at last. This was the ending I hadn't dared hope for. Not happiness. Exactly. But freedom. The kind that comes when you've faced every truth and survived it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes that light can come from even the darkest places. Leave a comment. Tell me what you felt. And remember, truth always finds its way to the surface.